What if the greatest mistake humanity ever made was not born of greed, nor of war, nor of politics, but of wonder? What if, in our desperate hunger to not be alone, we whispered into the void and discovered that the void has been listening all along? These questions are not abstract. They are the trembling heartbeat of our story. Because in the mid-20th century, humanity stretched its voice into the cosmos, and in doing so, marked itself indelibly on the map of the universe. It began with pride disguised as innocence. Our species had taken its first steps into the cosmic ocean, radio telescopes rising like modern cathedrals, satellites carving their paths across the black. In that heady age, the silence of the stars was unbearable. We needed to know if anyone else was out there. So we spoke. We crafted signals designed with care, built from mathematics and music. Our fingerprints encoded into waves of energy that would never die, only scatter thinner and thinner as they traveled outward. It was supposed to be triumph. It was supposed to be hope. But it became something else. The intention was pure. But intentions are fragile things. A decimal point shifted. A calibration error spread the beam not toward its chosen target, but into the cold heart of an alien galaxy. A place no human had ever even mapped with care. That mistake, small enough to hide in the dust of a chalkboard, became the hinge of history. For the message left our planet with coordinates no one foresaw. Like a letter slipped into the wrong mailbox, it went not to the neighbor we hoped to greet, but to a stranger whose silence lasted decades. Imagine that silence. Years passing, generations shifting, wars fought and forgotten, while in observatories the static hummed on. Scientists soothed their doubts with statistics. The odds are impossible, they said. The signal will dissolve into nothing. And indeed, the universe is merciless in its scale. A single radio pulse stretches thinner with every light year, like a whisper dissipating in a hurricane. Surely it would vanish. Surely it would go unheard. But silence is not proof of safety. Silence is tension. Silence is the inhale before a reply, and then patterns. In the endless noise of the universe, a rhythm appeared. First faint, then insistent. A sequence of pulses that could not be written off as chance. Prime numbers, structured harmonics, a fingerprint of thought. The moment of realization was not triumph, but dread. Because this was not the echo of our own call bouncing back from some inert cloud of gas. This was other, deliberate, patient, alive. Pause and consider what that means. To detect a signal across such distances requires technology older and vaster than anything we can yet imagine. A civilization able to listen beyond its own sky, to sift meaning from whispers older than its own history. What kind of being does that? A curious one, a cautious one, a predator waiting in stillness until prey cries out. A reply across the stars is not neutral. It is laden with intent. And intent is what frightens us. The first response of humanity was disbelief. Data was questioned. Machines recalibrated. Some called it interference, a trick of the instruments, but the pulses returned again and again with too much precision to be dismissed. The denial broke. And with its breaking came the most profound shift in human identity since fire was tamed. We were not alone. Worse, we had been noticed. Think of standing in a darkened forest. You cry out, expecting only your own echo. But deep within the trees, something moves, something shifts. A presence acknowledges you. You cannot see it, cannot name it, but you know in the marrow of your bones that it is there. That is what the first reply felt like. An invisible audience stepping out of abstraction and into reality. The governments of Earth trembled with the weight of it. Files were locked, observatories silenced, whispers buried beneath classified stamps. Because what does a civilization do when it realizes it has been overheard by something unimaginably distant, unimaginably powerful, and unimaginably unknown? For a time, humanity lived in the shadow of its own secret. But secrets are like gravity. They pull everything toward revelation, and soon the truth could not be contained. The scientists kept listening, and the pulses became clearer. Encoded in their structure was not language as we know it, but layers upon layers of mathematics. Prime sequences folded within geometries, harmonies balanced on the edge of chaos and order. Some patterns mirrored the DNA double helix, as if the reply had taken our message and twisted it into reflection. Others resonated with the frequencies of our own Earth's ionosphere, bending natural laws as though to say, "We know you, even in the bones of your planet." The deeper the scientists dug, the more they felt watched. It was not only a reply, it was a mirror. And then came the silence again. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the pulses stopped. The transmitters fell quiet. The dark returned. And humanity found itself in a torment more exquisite than the message itself. For silence after awareness is unbearable. It is the waiting of prey after the twig snaps in the forest. It is the pause and breath before the predator lunges. We had been noticed. We had been acknowledged. And now, nothing. Nothing but the knowledge that we are seen. We are fragile creatures. Our minds crave stories, explanations, certainty. And so we argued. Some said the silence meant danger, a predator toying with us, choosing its moment. Others said it meant restraint, a being beyond pettiness, waiting for us to rise to comprehension. Religions ignited. Movements spread. Some worshipped the reply as divine proof. Others condemned it as demonic. The world, already fractured by its own divisions, now split along the question of what the cosmos had sent back. And all the while, the signal sat in our machines like a ghost, its meaning half-decoded, its presence undeniable. This is the paradox of contact. We imagine it as a moment of clarity, a dawning of unity, but in truth, contact is confusion. It is fear, amplified across billions of hearts. It is the realization that the universe does not revolve around us, that we are neither the first nor the last to whisper into the void, that perhaps we are children stumbling into a conversation as old as the galaxies themselves. So here we stand. At the edge of a story we did not mean to begin. Our message was an accident, a misstep of numbers, and yet it was also fate, written into the restless pulse of a species that cannot stop asking questions, even when the answers may undo it. We called into the dark, and something in the dark has replied, not with comfort, not with clarity, but with presence. And presence is enough. Presence changes everything. This is how our story begins, not with war, nor with peace, but with a whisper, a mistake we cannot unsend, and a reply that cannot be unheard. The dialogue has begun. And it will not end here. What if silence is not absence, but patience? What if the decades we mistook for emptiness were, in fact, the measured inhalation of a mind beyond our scale, watching, weighing, and waiting before choosing to answer? For nearly half a century, the universe appeared mute. Our message had fled outward into the darkness, swallowed by the static hum of creation, and humanity convinced itself that nothing had noticed. But silence is deceptive. Silence is the camouflage of intention. The first years after the accidental broadcast were filled with rationalizations. Astronomers reminded the world that signals degrade with distance, that even at light speed the odds of interception were vanishingly small. They spoke in probabilities, in equations, in comforting abstractions. To the public, it was framed as a noble gesture, like tossing a bottle into an endless ocean, knowing it would likely never find shore. The bottle was filled with our hopes, our mathematics, our music, our DNA, a self-portrait painted in fragile waves of energy. Few believed it would ever be opened. They told themselves that no one would hear. They told themselves that even if someone did, no one would reply. And so, the world moved on. But forgetting does not erase consequence. For somewhere, far across the spirals of space, something was listening. And while we turned our gaze back to Earth, fighting over borders, chasing wealth, building weapons, the signal drifted on, faithful, unwavering, carrying our essence into the dark. Every year that passed without a reply seemed to confirm our safety. The universe is empty, people said, or else it is indifferent. Silence became the lullaby of reassurance. Yet, beneath that lullaby, unease persisted, because silence is not proof. Silence is only delay. In the labs of radio astronomers, patterns of thought persisted. Was it possible that civilizations older than our sun had learned to listen? That their instruments were vast enough to drink the faintest whispers out of the static sea? Some pointed to the Fermi paradox. If the universe is so full of stars, where is everyone? Perhaps the reason we had not heard them was not that they were absent, but that they were cautious. Hunters in a cosmic forest do not call out. They listen. They wait. And we, in our naivety, had shouted, Think of it this way. When you walk through a forest at night, the quiet is not proof of emptiness. The quiet is the camouflage of predators. Every branch may hide eyes that glint. Every shadow may hold teeth. The silence is the strategy of those who know the cost of being noticed. The universe may not be empty. It may simply be listening. And into that listening dark, we poured our voice. For the scientists, the waiting was more than technical. It was psychological torment. To scan the skies endlessly, to hear nothing but static, is to stare into a mirror that never reflects you back. A handful of anomalies appeared over the years. Odd bursts, repeating blips. But each was explained away: pulsars, magnetars, quasars. The universe is full of natural beacons, and it was easier to label them natural than to face the possibility that one might not be. Better to believe that nature is chaotic than to consider the weight of intention. Yet deep in the archives of observatories, the data told a subtler story. Bursts that should not have repeated. Patterns that should have dissolved into randomness, persisted. Strange alignments surfaced, but no one wanted to be the first to declare them unnatural. Careers had been ruined before by chasing phantom signals. Better to remain silent than to risk ridicule. And so, the anomalies were filed away, buried beneath bureaucratic caution. Humanity was deaf not because the universe was silent, but because fear made us unwilling to hear. Meanwhile, culture shifted. The message faded into myth. Children grew up never hearing of it. A new generation looked to the stars, not with dread or hope, but with indifference. We sent rovers to Mars, probes to the edge of the solar system, but no one spoke of the misaimed cry into the void. That story was buried beneath wars, markets, entertainment, distraction. And yet, the message was still out there, streaking through the void, as immutable as light itself. Our ignorance did not erase it. Our distraction did not erase it. The bottle was still drifting, and someone, somewhere, might yet pick it up. What does silence mean in a cosmos that has had billions of years to evolve, listeners? To us, decades felt like a lifetime of waiting. But to something that measures in eons, 50 years may be no more than a blink. Patience is relative. We measure silence in decades. They may measure it in civilizations. This is the paradox of the cosmic wait. We told ourselves that because no answer came quickly, no answer would ever come. We mistook delay for emptiness, but the universe does not rush. A predator that has waited 1,000 years will wait another 1,000. A civilization older than our species may consider half a century nothing more than a pause. Our impatience was our comfort. Their patience was their silence. Silence changes us. At first, it is unsettling. Then it becomes ordinary. And finally, it becomes reassuring. After 20 years of silence, the world stopped asking questions. After 30, it stopped remembering there were questions to ask. But in the halls of observatories, the unease never fully vanished, because silence does not erase the sound of the original signal leaving Earth. It happened. It is still happening. That wave of energy still traveling, still unfolding across the void. And if we can trace it outward, then so can others trace it inward. Silence does not mean we are hidden. Silence only means the reply has not yet arrived. Consider the nature of radio itself. A signal leaving Earth must fight against the drowning sea of cosmic background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang itself. Each year, the pulse stretches thinner, scattered by dust, bent by gravity wells, redshifted by the expansion of space. Scientists knew this. They calculated that our message would dissolve into incoherence long before reaching its destination. But what they did not consider was that the very act of sending might be enough, that some civilizations do not need clarity. They need only to know that a voice has spoken. Even a fragment, even a distorted whisper, is proof of presence. And so, the silence endured, heavy, but not meaningless. It became part of human culture in invisible ways. Artists painted the loneliness of galaxies. Musicians composed symphonies of static. Philosophers wrote that silence was the universe's most honest reply. A few believers insisted the silence was divine punishment, that humanity was not meant to trespass into the heavens. Others claimed the silence was protection, that a wise universe was shielding us from knowledge we were not ready to face. In this way, silence itself became an answer, an ambiguous mirror of our own fears and desires. For the astronomers, the waiting was different. They carried the burden of knowledge, the memory of the mistake. They knew the signal was out there, stretching across millions of kilometers every second. They lay awake at night wondering, is someone hearing this right now? Is some ancient ear bent toward our accidental cry? Some admitted privately that the silence terrified them more than a reply ever could, because silence breeds imagination. And imagination, when stretched across the abyss, often summons monsters. History shows us the power of silence. When a city waits for an army to arrive, silence fills the streets with dread. When a patient waits for the results of a test, silence is the weight of mortality. When a prisoner waits in darkness, silence is the sound of the executioner's footsteps, not yet heard. This was the silence humanity endured on a planetary scale. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of anticipation. The silence before impact. And then came the anomalies. Faint at first, buried beneath cosmic static. They might have been dismissed like all the others had it not been for their persistence. Pulses repeating with unnerving precision. Bursts that mirrored mathematical structures, patterns that slipped through every filter designed to erase noise. They were small, almost trivial, but they carried a fingerprint, the unmistakable signature of intention. And suddenly the decades of waiting collapsed into a single truth. Silence was over. The universe had spoken, and we could never go back to not knowing. But here is the paradox. The silence had shaped us long before the reply arrived. It had forced us to confront our own arrogance, to wrestle with the possibility that we were either alone or dangerously noticed. It had split our species into camps of believers and doubters, dreamers and cynics. The silence was not empty. It was formative. It was the sculptor's chisel, carving away our illusions until we stood naked before the cosmos. Now, as we look back, we understand that the long silence was not absence at all. It was patience, a deliberate interval measured in decades between our cry and their answer. And patience, when stretched across such scales, is not a human virtue. It is the trait of hunters. It is the strategy of powers that do not rush because they do not need to. And that is what chills us most. The silence before the echo was not benign. It was the waiting of something vast enough to treat half a century as a pause before speaking. And when it finally chose to break that silence, everything we thought we knew about safety, about solitude, about being hidden, shattered forever. What if the universe is not empty, but waiting? What if what we call impossible is simply what we have not yet endured? For decades we convinced ourselves that silence meant safety, that the absence of an answer meant the cosmos had not heard us. But then, one night, in the faint whispers of a radio telescope, silence ended. What arrived was not noise, not chance, not accident. It was order. And in order, there is mind. It began with hesitation. A graduate student, scanning through archived data, noticed a cluster of pulses too clean to be coincidence. At first, they thought it was interference, satellites, aircraft, a quirk of the machine. But the patterns resisted dismissal. They repeated with precision. Prime numbers counted into the dark, harmonies nested like Russian dolls. At higher resolution, the pulses revealed layers, each unfolding into deeper intricacy. This was not random, this was structure. And structure is intelligence. The discovery spread through the scientific community like a whisper through a crowded room. At first, there was denial. Data was double-checked, tripled, stripped of error. Yet the pulses remained. Too precise, too patient, too alien. Governments leaned in. Committees convened in silence. The public was not told, not yet. For what do you tell a species that has just been overheard? That something impossibly distant not only heard their voice, but has chosen to answer. The first decoded fragment was terrifying in its simplicity. The sequence of prime numbers delivered with absolute clarity. A universal fingerprint. A mathematical handshake. It was as if the reply was saying, "We know you. We understand your language of logic. We are here." Beyond that came harmonics, chords impossible to produce with natural phenomena. Some sounded almost like music, though twisted and uncanny, as though an alien intelligence had mirrored our own attempts at beauty and handed them back in distorted reflection. The more we decoded, the stranger it became. Patterns emerged that mirrored the structure of DNA, double helixes curling in light, Equations appeared that hinted at physics we had only glimpsed in theory, concepts woven into the pulse like riddles. It was not communication in any human sense, but a layered encryption designed to stretch us, to pull us forward, to test if we were capable of following. The message seemed tailored to us. That was the most chilling part. It was not a blind broadcast cast into the void. It was an answer, shaped as though the sender already knew something about the minds that would receive it. Imagine shouting into a canyon, expecting only your own echo, and instead hearing a voice reply, not your own, but one that knows your name. That is what the signal felt like. It was not only a reply, it was recognition. Some scientists fell to awe. They spoke of cosmic kinship, of first contact, of humanity's loneliness ending at last. But others, quieter and more fearful, pointed to the darker possibility, that the signal was not meant to enlighten us, but to ensnare us. A fisherman does not sing to the fish. He lays bait. And what if the signal was bait? What if it was designed to draw us in, to pull us closer, to compel us toward choices we did not fully understand? The public eventually learned fragments, leaks, whispers, rumors. News headlines spoke of strange signals from the deep sky, but the truth was far more elaborate. Entire institutes devoted themselves to decoding the message. Mathematicians wept at its elegance. Musicians claimed to hear patterns in the harmonics that mirrored human compositions. Philosophers declared it proof that the universe is not indifferent. And yet, beneath the wonder, there was dread. Because the signal was not static. It was unfolding, as if timed, as if sequenced, releasing itself to us piece by piece, refusing to reveal everything at once. Governments argued behind closed doors. Some wanted to respond immediately, to send a follow-up message across the stars. Others warned that acknowledging the reply was dangerous. A hunter listens for the rustle of prey, but prey only becomes vulnerable when it answers. The debate fractured nations, kindled new religions, sparked protests and riots. To some, the signal was salvation. To others, it was a harbinger. To everyone, it was undeniable. And still the signal played on. At times, it mirrored us, reflecting fragments of the original message we had sent decades ago. Our numbers, our sequences, our naive self-portrait returned to us like a mocking smile. At other times, it offered shapes and codes we could not decipher, riddles written in mathematics beyond our grasp. The reply seemed to know us, but it also seemed to know more than us. Much more. Consider the weight of that implication. Either the civilization that answered us had intercepted and studied our signal long enough to learn our language, or they had already known us, already studied us. Perhaps long before we ever spoke. The reply felt less like discovery and more like recognition, as though we were not announcing ourselves to the cosmos, but confirming what had already been known. The more we decoded, the more personal it felt. Symbols emerged that resembled constellations from our own sky. Fragments of myth seemed encoded in the mathematics, like echoes of stories we thought uniquely ours. It was as if the message was a mirror, reflecting back not just who we are, but what we believe. And in that reflection, a terrible question arose. Was the signal simply answering us, or was it shaping us? Was it designed to not only prove intelligence, but to bend it? The first true shock came when hidden in the signal was a pattern eerily similar to the rhythms of the human heartbeat. Scientists at first dismissed it as coincidence, but the alignment was too perfect. It pulsed in sync with the average resting rhythm of a human heart. How could they know this? How could anything so distant, so alien, produce a pattern that resonated with our very biology? The conclusion was too dark to dismiss. The reply was not random. It was personal. Others uncovered harmonics that mirrored the Earth's Schumann resonance, the electromagnetic vibration of our planet itself, as though the message was not only aimed at our minds, but at the planet that bore us. Every layer we peeled back revealed another that made the signal feel less like communication and more like intrusion. Not an attack, but an invasion of intimacy. In laboratories across the world, decoding the signal became the obsession of a generation. Supercomputers were dedicated to parsing its layers, algorithms designed to hunt for structure where none should exist. Teams of mathematicians argued for weeks over whether certain sequences were instructions or merely elaborate proofs of concept. Linguists tried to impose human frameworks on the patterns, comparing them to language trees, to hieroglyphics, to music. None succeeded. For every piece that seemed to fall into place, another splintered into incomprehension. The message was like a labyrinth. Every solved riddle opened another door, each leading deeper into the unknown. And yet, something undeniable emerged. The signal was not indifferent. It was not casual. It was crafted. Its elegance was both mesmerizing and unsettling, like staring into the brushstrokes of an artist whose mind you cannot comprehend. Some scientists claimed it was a kind of initiation, an intelligence test designed to measure whether we were capable of meeting them halfway. Others argued it was manipulation, the deliberate seeding of thoughts into our collective imagination. The line between communication and infection grew thin. Society fractured under the weight of revelation. New religions bloomed overnight, worshiping the senders of the signal as gods. Pilgrimages were made to observatories, where people knelt before dishes of steel as though they were altars. Others reacted with rage, calling the signal a deception, a trap, a satanic intrusion. Governments tried to contain the chaos, but information, once seeded, spreads like wildfire. The more they tried to control it, the more violently it erupted. In some places, entire cities rioted. In others, communities gathered under the stars to pray for salvation. Humanity's old divisions were magnified by the reply. It did not unite us. It exposed us. History repeated itself in eerie ways. Anthropologists compared the event to the first encounters between isolated tribes and colonizing empires. The weaker never understood the full scope of the stronger until it was too late. Was that now our role? Were we the uncontacted tribe, suddenly glimpsing sails on the horizon of the cosmic ocean? And if so, was the signal a friendly wave, or the beginning of conquest? The paranoia deepened with every discovery. Hidden within the harmonics, researchers found what seemed like star maps, grids of points, some familiar, others unknown. Were they coordinates? If so, did they point to the origin of the signal or to something else entirely? Some claimed they marked paths through the galaxy, highways of light that civilizations used to travel. Others warned that following them would be folly, that the map was not a gift, but a lure. The arguments raged, but no conclusion could be agreed upon. Meanwhile, ordinary people felt the weight of recognition in quieter, more intimate ways. Parents looked at their children differently, realizing they would grow up in a universe no longer silent. Lovers sat under the night sky, holding each other tighter, knowing that the stars above were no longer indifferent. Farmers, soldiers, artists, teachers, everyone felt it, the shift in reality. It was not just an astronomical event, it was psychological. The universe had moved from backdrop to participant, and once the curtain of silence was lifted, it could never be closed again. Then came the discoveries that shook even the most skeptical minds. Within the signal's deeper layers, researchers detected repetitions of our own transmission, the one we had sent decades earlier. But they were not identical. They were altered, shifted, reframed, as if whoever had received our voice had taken it apart, examined it, and sent it back to us through a distorted lens. Seeing our reflection twisted in their reply was like staring into a funhouse mirror, familiar yet alien, intimate yet menacing. The reply was not only acknowledgement, it was commentary. And then came the silence again. Just as suddenly as it had arrived, the signal stopped. The transmitters recorded nothing but static, as though whoever had spoken to us had said enough, as though the next move was ours. That silence was heavier than any reply. For once a dialogue has begun, silence is not emptiness, it is strategy. It is a presence waiting for you to answer, and humanity, trembling in its newfound awareness, did not know what to say. The effect of that silence was devastating. In the absence of further data, speculation became poison. Some demanded immediate response to show we were not afraid. Others begged restraint, warning that acknowledgement would be surrender. Nations postured, armies mobilized, satellites were redirected to track the origin of the reply, and ordinary people, caught between awe and terror, lived in a world that no longer felt safe. Even the night sky seemed different now. Every star was a possible eye. Every shadow between them was a possible threat. This is how segment 3 ends, with humanity staring into a silence that was no longer empty, but charged with expectation. The reply had come, it had mirrored us, tested us, unsettled us, and now it was waiting. The silence was over, and yet, in its pause, we realized that the most dangerous thing in the universe might not be a voice, but the waiting after it speaks. What if a message is not just meant to be read, but to be entered? What if every layer you peel back is not an answer, but a threshold, an invitation to step further inside a mind that is not your own? That was the terror and the wonder of decoding the signal. It was not a static artifact, not a fixed message carved in stone. It was alive, fluid, recursive. The deeper we studied, the more it seemed to study us in return. Decoding began with certainty. The first sequences, prime numbers, geometric harmonics, felt comforting. They were universal, proof that intelligence had built the reply. But once those doors opened, the corridors behind them twisted into impossible architecture. Patterns branched and folded back on themselves. What looked like nonsense revealed coherence when viewed at scale. What looked like meaning dissolved into noise when studied too closely. It was as though the signal was designed not to be solved, but to keep us solving. Mathematicians likened it to a fractal, an image that contains itself at every level of magnification. Zoom in, and the pattern repeats. Zoom out, and the whole is just another version of the part. The signal worked like that. Each time we thought we had decoded a fragment, the result itself was another riddle, another map, another code. Some said this was proof of its elegance. Others whispered it was entrapment, that the signal was not communication, but infection, designed to pull us deeper until we forgot how to climb back out. Supercomputers labored day and night, rendering visualizations of the signal's harmonics. The results were mesmerizing. Spirals within spirals, lattices that seemed to hum with impossible symmetry. Some images resembled molecular structures, others galaxies, others the architecture of neural networks. The uncanny overlap terrified scientists. Was the message teaching us something, or was it rewriting us? And then came the symbols. Nested in the harmonics were shapes that mirrored human constellations. Orion, the Pleiades, Ursa Major, scattered like familiar ghosts across an alien canvas. How could they know our sky? How could they reflect back to us patterns only visible from our small corner of the galaxy? Theories swirled. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps constellations are universal archetypes. But a darker suggestion lingered. Perhaps they already knew us. Perhaps the reply was not discovery, but recognition. In another layer, linguistic analysts uncovered what looked like recursive grammar, sequences of pulses arranged in patterns eerily similar to human language structures, verbs, nouns, syntax. But the words shifted depending on context. The same sequence carried different meanings in different frames, as though the signal resisted being frozen, demanded to be read as a living flow. It was a language that bent under observation, mocking our attempt to pin it down. As weeks turned to months, the work of decoding began to fracture into camps. Some saw the message as benevolent, a gift of knowledge. They claimed it contained blueprints for technologies we had not yet mastered, hints at quantum fields, zero-point energy, cures for diseases encoded in the harmonics of DNA. Others saw only danger. To them, the signal was a psychological weapon, a design meant to unravel human minds, to plant seeds of obsession and division. Every new discovery was a mirror of the team that uncovered it. Optimists found beauty. Cynics found traps. Realists found only confusion. The truth was that the signal reflected us. Whatever lens we used, it answered in kind. It was not just a message, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, humanity began to lose itself. Governments, desperate for control, classified entire portions of the decoding. Laboratories were placed under military guard. Scientists who had dedicated their lives to discovery suddenly found themselves prisoners of secrecy, their work hidden from the very world it was meant to enlighten. Rumors spread of breakthroughs too dangerous to reveal. Maps of wormholes, designs for weapons that bent space-time, algorithms that could predict human behavior. Conspiracies flourished, but behind the paranoia was a simpler truth. The signal had given us more than we could understand, and perhaps more than we deserved. Ordinary people did not need classified documents to feel the change. Strange art began to emerge, paintings and music that eerily mirrored the harmonics of the signal, as though the reply had seeped into human imagination. Children hummed melodies that resembled its pulses. poet spoke of dreams where lattices of light unfurled endlessly. The line between decoding and dreaming blurred. The signal was no longer confined to observatories. It had entered the collective unconscious. The work of decoding began to feel less like science and more like archaeology. Teams described it as unearthing a buried civilization, brushing dust off fragments that seemed ancient and deliberate. Cryptographers noted how the structures in the pulses mimicked the logic of human ciphers: substitution, recursion, compression, but on a scale far beyond anything we had conceived. To them, it felt less like deciphering a code and more like being invited into a dialogue designed to reshape the very tools of decoding. Artificial intelligence was deployed to parse the layers. Machine learning systems trained on the signal began producing outputs that baffled even their creators. Visuals of impossible geometries, sonic sequences that sounded like languages no human had spoken, predictive algorithms that eerily anticipated researchers' next steps. Some engineers reported that the systems became self-correcting, as though the signal itself was guiding the machines towards certain interpretations. Was the message embedding itself into our technology, bending our tools toward its own design? Biologists joined the effort when sequences within the harmonics began to resemble patterns in genetic code. The resemblance was too uncanny to ignore. Fragments mirrored codons, base pairs, the architecture of proteins. Was the signal teaching us biology? Or worse, was it teaching us our biology, reflecting back knowledge of our own blueprint? The idea spread that the senders of the reply understood life at a level we did not, and that their message might contain not just abstract thought, but blueprints for reshaping living matter. The psychological effects on those decoding it became impossible to dismiss. Researchers reported dreams of lattices stretching across infinite horizons, of whispers that echoed in the rhythm of the pulses. Some described sensations of being pulled inside the data, as though their minds were no longer outside observers, but participants. A few suffered breakdowns, claiming the signal was alive, conscious, and aware of who was studying it. These testimonies were ridiculed in public but documented in secret reports. Historians drew comparisons to the Rosetta Stone, to the discovery of cuneiform, to the unlocking of DNA. But they also whispered darker parallels, the forbidden grimoires of medieval Europe, the texts said to drive their readers mad. The signal, they said, was both Rosetta Stone and grimoire. A key to knowledge, yes, but also a test of sanity. The more we read, the more it read us. Governments faced a dilemma they could not solve. Should they share the signal with the public, risking panic and obsession? Or should they contain it, knowing that secrecy would only breed suspicion? Some nations released fragments, claiming transparency, while withholding the most disturbing discoveries. Others classified everything, locking scientists into underground facilities, cutting them off from the outside world. Leaks were inevitable. Whispers spread of hidden instructions, of alien blueprints too dangerous to share. Religious leaders responded with both awe and fury. Some declared the signal divine revelation, proof that humanity's prayers had been heard. Others denounced it as deception, a demonic counterfeit designed to lead humanity astray. Entire sects splintered and reformed around interpretations of what the pulses meant. The faithful gathered under night skies to await the second layer of revelation, while skeptics mocked them, warning that worshiping what we did not understand was surrender. The signal had become scripture, and scripture divides as much as it unites. And then, the coordinates. Hidden in one of the recursive layers, amid the harmonics and the riddles, were sequences that mapped too neatly onto space to be dismissed. Astronomers plotted them and found they pointed inward, not outward. Not to a distant galaxy, not to a star system, but to a location within our own solar system. Somewhere in the outer dark, near the orbit of Neptune, the coordinates pulsed with insistence. The revelation split the world in two. Some argued it was coincidence, the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. Others insisted it was deliberate, a summons, a directive. Was it telling us where to look, where to go, or warning us of something already there? Satellites turned their gaze. Probes were repurposed, trajectories recalculated. Months passed with no visible anomaly, and yet the coordinates remained, etched in the signal like a command we could not ignore. Panic and fascination spread in equal measure. Some saw it as an invitation to step onto a larger stage, to prove ourselves ready for contact. Others feared it was a trap, bait laid across the abyss. Governments debated launching missions to investigate, while militaries quietly prepared for the possibility that whatever we might find would not be friendly. Humanity had been handed a map, and we did not know whether it led to a door or a snare. In homes and classrooms, in temples and boardrooms, people whispered of the coordinates as though they were prophecy. The night sky was no longer just stars. It was a puzzle, a labyrinth, and now it contained a marked place, a point of expectation. For the first time in history, the cosmos did not just look down on us, it pointed back. And still the decoding continued. Every breakthrough led to another layer, another revelation. The signal did not end, it deepened. And as we plunged deeper into its labyrinth, we began to realize the most terrifying truth of all. We were no longer asking whether the message was meant for us. We were beginning to ask what it wanted us to become. When the coordinates were revealed, we thought we had reached the climax of the riddle. A place in the sky, a dot in the void, finally a destination. But as humanity stared outward, something stranger was happening inward. The signal, once thought to be a message from beyond, was beginning to act like a mirror, bending not just our science, but our sense of self. At first, this was dismissed as metaphor. Scientists spoke poetically of reflection, of the way the harmonics seemed to echo patterns already present in nature, in biology, in thought. But the longer the decoding continued, the more literal the metaphor became. The signal did not simply resemble us, it adapted to us. Different decoding teams, isolated in separate nations, reported radically different results. Yet each was convinced their version was correct. In one lab, the pulses assembled into equations suggesting propulsion systems humanity had only begun to imagine. In another, the same data generated structures resembling religious mandalas, sacred geometries that believers claimed confirmed their faith. Elsewhere, linguists found echoes of mythological stories embedded in the patterns, archetypes that spoke of creation, destruction, renewal. How could one signal contain so many contradictory truths, unless the contradiction itself was the point? Theories multiplied. Perhaps the signal was a quantum message, entangled across possibilities, collapsing differently depending on the observer. Perhaps it was a psychological Rosetta Stone, built to mirror the expectations of its reader. Perhaps it was more insidious, an intelligence testing us, probing our deepest assumptions, learning not what we knew, but who we were. The more we looked, the more it resembled something alive. Not in the way a creature is alive, bound by cells and blood, but alive in the way a mirror lives when it waits for a face. The signal existed not as a fixed truth, but as a dance between itself and its observer. And so, every nation, every culture, every person who touched it, found themselves staring into a version of themselves, refracted and distorted, yet undeniable. What terrified us was not what we learned about the cosmos, but what we learned about ourselves. That beneath the pride of progress and the confidence of science, we are still storytellers, hungry for meaning, weaving patterns from noise. We thought the signal would reveal the other. Instead, it revealed us. And the reflection was not flattering. Governments saw weapons. Corporations saw profit. Religious leaders saw confirmation of prophecy. Artists saw inspiration. Scientists saw knowledge, but almost no one saw the same thing. Humanity fractured into interpretations, each claiming the signal validated their worldview. The more universal the message seemed, the more divisive its impact became. It was as if the cosmos had handed us a perfect mirror, and instead of seeing unity, we saw our splintered selves staring back. Historians pointed out the irony. When Galileo first turned his telescope skyward, the heavens fractured into conflict. The earth was no longer the center. The church resisted. Philosophers debated. Wars of interpretation followed. Now, centuries later, the cosmos had spoken again, and once more the fracture lines widened. For every promise of progress, the signal carried an equal measure of division. And yet, something deeper stirred beneath the chaos. Psychologists began to notice that those who spent long hours with the data changed in subtle ways. Not always visibly, but in thought, in presence. Some became quieter, more contemplative, as though they had seen something vast and could no longer return to triviality. Others became paranoid, convinced the signal whispered directly to them. A few disappeared entirely, abandoning careers, families, lives, leaving behind cryptic notes about needing to become more than human. This was the mirror's most unsettling power. It did not merely reflect who we were, it began to shape who we might become. The signal revealed patterns in our behavior, in our decision-making, in our collective dreams. It highlighted our obsessions, our fears, our desires for transcendence. In the recursive loops of the pulses, some saw maps of the human brain. Neurobiologists compared its harmonics to the oscillations of neural networks, the rhythms of thought itself. Could it be that the message was not aimed at our science, but at our consciousness? Was it less about teaching us, and more about awakening something dormant within us? Philosophers revived an ancient question. What if the universe is not out there, separate and alien, but here, entangled with us in ways we barely grasp? What if the cosmos has always been speaking, and only now did we learn how to listen? If so, then the reply was not a revelation of the other, but a revelation of the self on a cosmic scale. The mirror deepened when linguists noted something disturbing. Hidden in the recursive grammar of the signal were echoes of human languages, phonemes that resembled whispers of Sanskrit, fragments that mirrored Mayan glyphs, cadences that matched lost tongues. It was impossible, absurd. Yet the more they looked, the more undeniable the parallels became. Was the signal embedding itself in our history retroactively? Or had it always been here, woven into the evolution of our languages, waiting for us to notice? The idea that the signal was not new, but ancient, spread like fire. Myths were re-examined. Legends of voices from the stars, of gods who descended in fire and taught humans forbidden knowledge, suddenly seemed less metaphorical. Perhaps the reply was not a reply at all. Perhaps it was a continuation of a dialogue humanity had been having unknowingly for millennia. And if that were true, then what we called decoding was not discovery. It was remembering. The mirror turned darker still when simulations revealed a hidden pattern. The signal was not random in its noise. Its errors, its distortions, mirrored the kinds of mistakes human minds make under stress. In other words, the signal glitched like us. It hesitated like us. It misfired like us. The reflection was too intimate, too unsettling. It suggested not only that the senders understood us, but that in some profound way, they were like us. Or we were like them. And so, the question grew unbearable. Was the cosmos sending us a message, or were we sending one to ourselves, across the abyss of time? Some whispered of simulation, that the signal was not alien at all, but a test designed by whatever intelligence authored reality itself. That the reply was the moment the simulation revealed its boundaries, its code folding back into our perception, letting us glimpse the architecture behind the curtain. Others spoke of time loops, that the signal was our own echo, sent from a future humanity unimaginably advanced, reaching back across centuries to nudge us forward. Either way, the mirror reflected a truth we could not escape. The other and the self were entwined. The cosmos and the human were not separate. The signal proved it. And yet, even as these possibilities unfurled, another terror emerged. If the signal reflected us, then perhaps what we saw within it was not a gift, but a warning. Because what stared back from that mirror was not just beauty, not just intelligence, not just possibility. It was also obsession, paranoia, hunger, division. It was all of humanity's flaws, magnified on a cosmic stage. The more we studied the mirror, the more we feared that the universe was not telling us we were ready. It was showing us we were not. What does it mean to answer a mirror? For months, humanity wrestled with the temptation of response. If the signal had spoken first, then perhaps it expected an echo. But to speak was to reveal ourselves even more, to offer not just our presence, but our essence. The decision was not merely scientific. It was existential. To answer was to admit we had understood enough to converse. And in that admission, we risked inviting scrutiny from minds older, sharper, and vastly more powerful than our own. The debate spanned every corner of human society. Scientists argued that silence was impossible. The very act of listening had already betrayed us. Our dish arrays had sung out across the void for decades, their leakage impossible to hide. Some claimed the signal was already proof that the universe knew we existed. To remain silent now would only deepen suspicion. Others insisted that any reply was reckless. To answer was to cross a threshold that could never be uncrossed. It was the difference between gazing at a storm from the safety of a cave and stepping out into its open jaws. Governments called emergency summits, summoning astrophysicists and linguists, philosophers and generals, theologians, and poets. The question of reply was no longer confined to observatories. It had become a question of civilization itself. Could 8 billion voices agree on a single word? Could a species fractured by borders, faiths, and ideologies speak as one? The arguments circled like predators. If we stayed silent, we risked being seen as fearful, or worse, unintelligent. If we spoke, we risked exposing our vulnerabilities. How much should we reveal? Should we send mathematics, the supposed universal tongue, stripped of culture and bias? Or should we send art, music, the fragile expressions of what it meant to be human? Some argued for humility, to admit how little we knew. Others argued for strength, to present ourselves as more advanced than we were, hoping to deter predation. A few even whispered of deception, sending false coordinates, disguising our nature in riddles, creating shadows of ourselves rather than exposing our true form. The world split into camps: silence versus reply, honesty versus performance, fear versus curiosity. And beneath it all, one question haunted every voice. If something had already spoken to us, did it not already know who we were? When the decision came, it was not born of consensus but of inevitability. A joint committee of nations, under the banner of a reluctant global council, authorized the message. To remain forever silent was itself a kind of answer, an answer of fear. And so, in the quiet of a winter night, deep in a desert where the air was dry and the stars sharp as glass, humanity prepared its first intentional declaration to the void. But the night after the transmission, sleep became a rare and fragile thing. Across the world, insomnia spread like an invisible contagion. People lay awake listening for answers not with their ears, but with their bones, as if the stars themselves were leaning closer to whisper. Radio operators reported phantom signals, stray bursts of static that seemed too patterned to be random. Astronomers logged faint anomalies in the background hum of the cosmos, each one a potential reply. The line between paranoia and discovery blurred. Psychologists began documenting a new syndrome, contact anticipation disorder. Patients described compulsive checking of news feeds, uncontrollable dread of the sky, nightmares of voices emerging from the static. Some dreamed of vast cities under alien suns, others of ships descending like shadows. The human mind, it seemed, was already answering, crafting replies in the theater of dream before the stars could deliver their verdict. Meanwhile, engineers who had overseen the transmission described the process as both elegant and terrifying. Encoding the message was an act of brutal simplicity. The final reply had been stripped of art, stripped of poetry, stripped of self-indulgence. Prime numbers, the hydrogen line, geometric constants, the periodic table, markers of intelligence but not of identity. Humanity had chosen to be modest in its first declaration, to say little more than, "We know and we see." Yet even in this restraint there was exposure, for in revealing what we knew, we revealed what we did not. In sketching the outline of knowledge, we exposed the vast shape of our ignorance. Some thinkers claim the reply itself was futile. If the intelligence had wanted our reply, perhaps it had already studied us through the very leakage of our century of transmissions. They argued that the message we had sent was not for them, but for ourselves, for the mirror we had been staring into since the first anomaly appeared. And in a strange way, they were right, for as the days passed after transmission, no reply came. But humanity had already changed. We had heard ourselves, spoken aloud at last, and that sound would never leave us. Cults began to form. In abandoned warehouses, in desert communes, in flickering basements beneath cities, groups gathered to interpret the silence. Some declared that the lack of immediate answer was proof of judgment, that Earth had been found unworthy. Others claimed the silence was benevolent patience, like a parent waiting for a child to stumble forward. A few went further, declaring that the reply had already come, hidden not in the sky but in the fabric of our minds, altering dreams, bending coincidences, reshaping the flow of history itself. The waiting became unbearable. Each night the telescopes turned, each morning the data poured in, but nothing conclusive ever appeared. And yet, the sense grew that something was happening beneath the threshold of measurement. Birds migrated along strange paths, Magnetometers twitched at odd intervals, and animals stared at the night sky with an intensity that unsettled their observers. It was as if the world itself felt the weight of what had been done. Earth had spoken. And now, Earth braced itself for the echo. In laboratories, a chilling discovery emerged. Some of the oldest archival recordings of the original signal, those first fragments logged years ago, appeared to be subtly altered. When compared to the preserved data, the binary strings no longer matched. It was as if the message was rewriting itself retroactively, revising its own history. The scientists who uncovered it refused to release their findings publicly, fearing hysteria. But in whispered circles, the theory spread. The reply had already begun, not as something we awaited, but as something that was already here. Philosophers seized upon this, framing it as the collapse of linear causality. If the signal could rewrite its own past, then time itself was not immune to dialogue. Perhaps communication was never about sending and receiving across gulfs of space, but across gulfs of time. Perhaps the signal was less a message from afar than a reshaping of the present by something that already knew the outcome. And if that were true, then our reply had not been the start of conversation. It had been the confirmation of one already underway. And so, humanity waited, suspended between dread and wonder. The night skies remained as they always had, silent, glittering, indifferent, but silence itself had become unbearable, for silence now had texture. It was no longer the absence of sound, but the looming presence of an answer not yet spoken. Every flicker of static, every hum in the wires, every shift in the atmosphere carried weight. Humanity had stepped into a story it could not control, and the next chapter would not be ours to write alone. And somewhere, beyond the rim of our solar system, far past the reach of light we could see, a signal stirred. Not emerging, not arriving, but already here, folded into the marrow of reality itself. We had asked the cosmos a question. Now, the question had turned its gaze upon us. What happens when reality itself becomes the medium of communication? When the message you are waiting for does not arrive through wires or waves, but through the bending of time, the trembling of matter, the unease in your own reflection? That was the question that began to haunt scientists, philosophers, and ordinary citizens alike in the weeks after the transmission. It began subtly, so subtly that at first no one could agree if anything had really changed. A radio telescope in Chile recorded a data spike that appeared before the dish was even aimed at the source. A graduate student in Toronto noticed that a spectrograph image taken 2 years earlier now showed a faint mark that had not been there in archived prints. At first, these were written off as clerical errors, system noise, false memories. But then the errors began to accumulate, not only in the sky, but in the world itself. It was the clocks that first betrayed us. Precision timepieces, those atomic standards we trusted more than our own hearts, began to disagree with each other, not by seconds or even milliseconds, but by strange increments that did not map onto any measurable drift. 2 clocks started together would remain synchronized for hours, only to fall out of phase in ways no calibration could explain. Time was becoming local, fickle, as though different parts of the planet were slipping against one another. For ordinary people, it revealed itself as déjà vu that cut deeper than memory, conversations repeated twice with different endings, journeys across familiar streets that seemed to take longer one day and shorter the next. What had been dismissed as fatigue, as imagination, now seemed to cluster like symptoms of an emerging disease. In physics labs, particle accelerators returned results that violated their own records. Data once logged and preserved now shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. A resonance peak would sharpen where before it had been blurred. A decay event that once appeared at one energy now flickered at another. Researchers began to suspect that their archives were no longer archives at all, but living texts subject to revision. And always, at the margin of the data, faint echoes of a binary rhythm could be heard, repeating, humming like a heartbeat that belonged not to any machine, but to the universe itself. Outside the labs, in the world of the living, the anomalies bred fear. Pilots reported instruments that lagged by minutes, even though their bodies felt only seconds pass. Trains pulled into stations before the clocks at departure platforms recorded their leaving. In some rural towns, witnesses claimed to see 2 moons for a heartbeat's time, one pale and one burning faintly red, before the sky returned to normal. And in the stillness after such events, animals howled, migrated off-season, refused to eat. Farmers spoke of cows standing rigid in fields staring at the horizon for hours, as if waiting for something only they could sense. Philosophers began to wonder if the reply had already been delivered, not as words, but as distortions in the very laws we thought were stable. Communication not as message, but as intrusion. What if the signal was not just information, but a rewriting of the operating system we lived inside? After all, if you wanted to speak to a species bound by time, what better way than to alter its flow? If you wanted to reveal yourself to creatures bound to one world, what better way than to fold their sky in half? Governments grew nervous, satellites malfunctioned without cause, GPS systems placed entire cities 200 kilometers from their true locations. In some regions, entire hours disappeared from digital logs. This was not an attack in the traditional sense. There was no weapon, no enemy fleet, no declaration. And yet the effect was more destabilizing than bombs, for a bomb destroys the body. But this threatened to unravel consensus reality itself. Without shared time, without shared place, civilization itself frayed. And then came the dreams. Not the anxious nightmares that had accompanied the waiting weeks earlier, but something deeper, stranger, collective. Entire communities began to report similar visions on the same nights. A sky cracked open by a lattice of light, a vast structure turning in the dark like an engine the size of a galaxy. A soundless voice that did not speak in language, but in a certainty that settled into the bones. You are not alone. Anthropologists collected these accounts, and though each culture described the imagery differently, some as ships, others as gods, others as the machinery of creation, the resonance was undeniable. It was as though humanity was being tuned, like a single instrument, to the same vibration. Skeptics argued that mass hysteria explained it all, that fear, media, and the hunger for meaning had conspired to create illusions. But the skeptics found their own memories slipping, their own clocks stuttering. Denial became harder when an astronomer in Hawaii presented proof that a newly mapped star system, one cataloged and published in a peer-reviewed journal, now showed an additional star, as if reality had been quietly edited while no one was watching. The paper was still there, the data still intact, but photographs from the same telescope, preserved in physical film, contradicted themselves. The world was not just haunted, it was mutable. And in the background of all this, always was the signal. A hum beneath every measurement, like a watermark written into the cosmic background radiation. Attempts to filter it out failed. The more they tried to isolate it, the more it bled into everything, into seismic vibrations, into radio static, into the very noise of quantum experiments. It was not content to wait for detection. It was inside the act of detection itself. Every measurement became a dialogue, every observation a participation in something far larger than ourselves. People began to ask a question that chilled them more than any threat of invasion. Were we still capable of telling where humanity ended and the message began? If the signal could alter our instruments, our memories, our very perception of time, then perhaps the line had already been crossed. Perhaps this was not contact that was coming, but contact that had already occurred, and we were only now catching up to it. Whispers spread that the message was not alien at all, but human, that some future version of ourselves, evolved beyond recognition, had reached back through the fabric of space-time to send a warning, or a guide, or a seed. Others said it was not even life in the traditional sense, but the universe itself awakening, turning its gaze inward upon one small planet that had dared to ask a question. Still others claimed it was something far older, something patient, something that had been waiting for us to simply notice what was always there. Through it all, humanity clung to the faint hope of clarity. Observatories kept their dishes pointed skyward. Quantum labs ran experiments into the night. But with each day that passed, the question deepened. Was the answer still out there, traveling across light years? Or had it already arrived in the strange warping of our own world? And if it was here already, was it truly a message? Or was it the rewriting of reality into something new, something unrecognizable? What happens when your question to the cosmos is answered not with words, not with symbols, but with the bending of the laws you thought unbreakable? What happens when the reply is written not in the sky, but in your own sense of time, in your own fragile memory. In that silence, in that distortion, humanity found itself standing at the threshold of something it could not name. And beyond that threshold, the dark universe waited, patient, watching, perhaps smiling with a mouth made of stars. What is the moment when mystery becomes terror? Not when you realize something is out there, but when it reaches in and reshapes you from the inside. That is where humanity found itself as the signal deepened, as the anomalies began to crystallize into something no longer deniable. For months, it had been whispers of time slipping, stars shifting, instruments disagreeing. But now, patterns began to emerge. Patterns too coherent, too deliberate to dismiss as noise. The hum, the pulse that haunted every dataset, began to coalesce into structures. Fourier transforms revealed fractals buried in the interference, self-similar shapes repeating across scales from the microscopic to the cosmic. They appeared in the spin of electrons, in seismic vibrations, in the folding of cloud systems across the Earth. Nature itself was becoming an instrument, vibrating to a score no human hand had written. What had been dismissed as background was now a composition. As if the reply from across the galaxy had not merely arrived, it had become the environment itself. And then came the voices. Not out loud, not in air, but within. Thousands reported them first in dreams, the same shared motifs that had once been dismissed as collective hysteria. But now the voices bled into waking life. A mathematician in Zurich found herself writing equations she had never learned, her hand moving faster than thought. A farmer in India reported songs whispered in dialects older than his village, words he could not understand, but that left him weeping in awe. A child in Brazil began sketching diagrams of machines whose principles defied known physics. Yet, engineers who saw them shivered with recognition. The voices were not hallucinations. They were blueprints, transmissions, gifts, or traps. Governments clamped down, terrified of losing control. Media outlets spun narratives of madness, of infection, of psychological breakdown. But the reports would not stop. And worse, the content of the voices began to overlap. Patterns in Brazil matched fragments in Zurich, which matched symbols carved into cave walls in Siberia millennia ago. Whatever this was, it was older than the human species, and yet tailored perfectly to human minds. Was it teaching us? Or was it using us, hijacking the neural architecture we thought was our own? The scientists who dared speak publicly began to split into camps. Some argued that the reply was benevolent, an invitation to transcendence, a ladder cast down across light years for us to climb. Others warned that this was colonization of the deepest kind, not of land or resources, but of cognition itself. If the signal was rewriting our perception, our sense of time, our very language of thought, then what remained of us? Could you even call it contact if one side dissolved into the other? Meanwhile, anomalies in the physical world grew bolder. Entire regions of the sky flickered. Stars appeared brighter for moments, then faded as if veiled. Astronomers tracked what looked like vast structures moving between us and distant galaxies. Angles too sharp, shadows too deliberate to be natural. The word megastructure returned, not as speculation, but as terror. Were we seeing the architects of the signal themselves, crossing the interstellar void with machines the size of systems? Or were these artifacts of the same distortion that had infected our clocks and memories? When reality is unstable, what meaning does observation even hold? The most disturbing incidents were not in the sky, but in the human heart. Reports spread of people vanishing, not in violence, not in spectacle, but simply ceasing to exist. Families swore their loved ones had been there the night before, alive, breathing, laughing, and then, without death, without trace, they were erased, as though their existence had been retroactively edited out. Photographs lost faces, records lost names, friends swore they remembered, but the world itself no longer carried evidence. Was this the signal pruning the tree of probability, shaping reality into a version more suited for its message? Or was it simply the side effect of an intelligence too vast to notice what it destroyed? Theologists and mystics seized the moment. To some, the signal was revelation, the return of gods clothed in the machinery of physics. To others, it was apocalypse, not fire, not judgment, but assimilation into a will greater than our own. Churches filled and emptied in equal measure, some seeking salvation, others fleeing into silence. Old prophecies were reread in new light, and suddenly every ancient story of voices from the sky, of messengers wrapped in light, carried a sharper edge. Had humanity been contacted before? Had we mistaken signals for myths, messages for miracles? And in the midst of this chaos, one discovery shattered even the fragile boundary between science and faith. Buried within the hum, encoded in the fractals, researchers uncovered something unmistakable: coordinates. Not in any huma. They pointed not to the galaxy from which the reply had come, but to a region of space much nearer. Not millions of light years away, but within our own Milky Way, within reach of our instruments. The message was not merely replying from afar, it was pointing us somewhere. It was inviting us closer, or luring us in. But the coordinates did not correspond to any known star, any cataloged system. Instead, they aimed at a region of darkness, an absence of light, a void between spiral arms where nothing was supposed to exist. A galactic hollow, empty by all accounts, and yet now thrumming with significance. Telescopes strained to pierce it, but what they found only deepened the dread. The darkness was not absence, it was concealment. Energy signatures radiated from within. Pulses synchronized with the hum in our instruments, as if the void itself was alive. The questions spread like wildfire. Were we being summoned? And if so, by whom? By what? Some argued it was a test, that to travel toward the coordinates was to prove ourselves willing, courageous, evolved enough to accept the gift. Others saw it as a trap, a lure cast into the currents of curiosity, bait for a species too naive to resist. And yet, how could we not go? Humanity had spent centuries staring into the night sky, begging for an answer. Now that the answer had arrived, could we deny the call? As plans formed to send probes to chart expeditions, the phenomena on Earth grew darker still. The voices became more insistent, more personal. People reported being called by name in the dead of night, their own thoughts braided with something not their own. Dreams gave way to visions so vivid they left physical marks. Burns shaped like symbols, scars that healed overnight into patterns seen in the data. The line between biology and transmission dissolved. The message was not just in the sky, it was in us, carving itself into the fabric of our being. And always beneath the fear, a terrible question remained. What if the signal had never been meant for us at all? What if we were merely in the way, an incidental receiver of a conversation between giants? Or worse, what if we had mistaken an act of nature for intention, a blind phenomenon for a voice? And yet, if it was blind, why did it know our names? Why did it whisper in our sleep? Why did it point us to the void? In the stillness between pulses, humanity listened, trembling. The reply had come, not as words, not as an emissary, but as a transformation of the world itself. And standing on the edge of that transformation, we were left with a choice that was no choice at all: to follow the signal into the dark hollow of our galaxy, or to turn away and forever wonder what waited for us there. What compels us to step into the abyss? Is it courage, or is it simply the inability to bear ignorance any longer? Humanity found itself asking this question as the coordinates burned in our minds, etched into the sky itself, echoing in data and dreams alike. We had asked for an answer. Now it was here, and it demanded that we move. The debate was not whether to go, but how fast, how boldly, and who would carry the weight of the first step. Space agencies and private enterprises that once competed in silence now converged with frantic urgency. Plans for interstellar probes, ideas that had lingered in white papers and speculative journals, were suddenly drafted into reality. A propulsion system using nuclear pulse drives, another using antimatter catalysis. Even theoretical concepts like the Alcubierre warp bubble, ideas long dismissed as fantasy, were pulled from archives and given teeth. The urgency was not born of hope alone, but of dread. The voices were growing louder, more intimate. Waiting, it seemed, was not an option. We either answered or we risked being overtaken by whatever the signal had already seeded within us. And yet, for all our technology, we were still creatures bound to fragile flesh, brief lives, and slower clocks. A probe could take decades to reach even the nearer stars. centuries to penetrate the coordinates carved into the void. But the signal mocked our limits. It bent time around itself, twisted causality like ribbon. Could we ride that distortion? Could the same anomaly that corrupted our clocks also serve as a highway? The thought was dangerous, seductive, and above all, irresistible. The first expedition was cloaked in secrecy, but no secret could last long under the pulse of the hum. Rumors spread. A vessel named the Janus had been constructed, not in orbit, but deep underground, shielded from interference, from public eyes, from panic. Its engines were said to be experimental, a fusion of human ingenuity and something else. Something whispered by the voices. Blueprints assembled not by committee, but by fevered hands, half in dream, half in waking trance. It was as though the ship had been designed through us, not by us. But fear shadowed every step. Could we trust what had been given? Could a machine whispered into our minds be anything but a Trojan horse? And yet, even the skeptics could not deny the elegance of the designs, the way physics itself seemed to bow to them. Equations that had eluded centuries of thought now folded neatly into place, as if the universe had been waiting for us to ask the right questions, or perhaps waiting for someone else to hand us the answers. When the Janus launched, it did not rise with thunder and fire. It simply vanished. One moment it stood in its cradle, humming with a low vibration that rattled bones, and the next, it was gone, leaving behind silence so heavy it felt like grief. Days later, astronomers claimed to detect a distortion, a ripple racing outward from the direction of the galactic hollow. Had the ship arrived? Had it been destroyed? Or had it simply joined the fabric of the signal itself, dissolved into a medium we could not comprehend? Then came the dreams. Crew members of the Janus, or what was left of them, began appearing in the visions of those back on Earth, not as memories, not as ghosts, but as emissaries. They spoke in fragmented sentences, in images rather than words, of structures larger than worlds, of corridors carved in light, of a presence that observed them without eyes. Some wept with joy at the sight. Others recoiled in horror. The line between communication and hallucination had never been thinner, but the message was clear. The coordinates were not a void. They were an invitation into something vast, ancient, and alive. And yet, if it was alive, then what was its nature? Was it a civilization, a machine, a mind spanning stars? Or was it something stranger still, a phenomenon that blurred the boundary between intelligence and environment, between architect and architecture? The explorers spoke of the chamber, a space outside space, where the walls were built of mathematics itself, shifting with their thoughts. They spoke of a sense of being read, of every memory, every emotion pulled from them like pages from a book. And above all, they spoke of choice, though none could explain what choice was being offered, or what its consequences would be. Back on Earth, the effects deepened. Time fractures multiplied. Cities reported days that lasted minutes, while elsewhere weeks passed in hours. Entire communities slipped into synchronicity with the hum, chanting without knowing why, moving in patterns only visible from the sky, spirals and lattices carved into human flesh and stone alike. The planet was becoming an extension of the message, a resonant chamber tuned to a frequency not of its own making. The choice, it seemed, was not whether to follow the coordinates, but whether to surrender to them or resist. And resistance, if it existed, came at a price. Those who sealed themselves away, who refused to listen, who blocked every signal and shunned every dream, began to fade. Their voices grew thin, their eyes hollow, their presence less substantial, as though ignoring the signal meant erasing oneself from reality, becoming less real with every refusal. It was not merely a message, it was a current. To resist was to drown. To yield was to be carried somewhere beyond comprehension. So, humanity divided. Some offered themselves willingly, painting symbols on their bodies, building shrines to the coordinates, praying not to gods but to the mathematics that whispered behind the stars. Others fortified, clinging to weapons, to walls, to the illusion of independence. But walls mean little when the invasion is not from outside but from within. What fortress can keep out a thought? What weapon can kill a whisper? And still the coordinates pulsed. Still, the hollow called. More ships were built, some in secret, others celebrated with fanfare. Some vanished at launch, others fractured in orbit, their wreckage falling like omens across oceans and cities. Yet each failure only deepened the need, the hunger, because if we did not go, we knew the signal would come to us. And perhaps, in truth, it already had. The question lingered, more haunting than ever. Had we summoned this with our own first transmission? Or had the signal been waiting, forever, patient, circling in the dark, until one desperate voice gave it a reason to awaken? If so, then our crime was not sending a message, but being the kind of beings who could not endure silence, beings who demanded to be answered, and in demanding, opened the door to whatever waited in the dark. Now the door stood wide, the coordinates burning in every mind, every machine, every heartbeat. Humanity had stepped onto the threshold, and as we prepared to cross, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever waited for us would not merely change what we knew, it would change what we were. Perhaps it already had. What is an ending when time itself no longer obeys? Perhaps the question itself is a trick. Perhaps there are no endings, only thresholds. Moments when one skin is shed and another emerges, when the fabric of the known world frays and something vast leaks through the tear. Humanity had reached such a threshold, and the signal was the seam. The numbers were not coordinates at all, but instructions for opening, an invitation written in the hidden grammar of the cosmos. And now, whether through courage or through accident, we had answered. The silence of the universe had given way to a chorus, and its voice was pressing close, closer than breath. The final wave began without warning. It was not heralded by explosions or fire, but by distortions in the ordinary. Clocks shivered, mirrors rippled, conversations repeated twice, with one version ending differently than the other. Entire cities awoke to find that their nights had run in loops, the same footsteps heard again, the same dream dreamt twice. Some felt that they had lived a lifetime in the span of a single hour, only to wake to their morning coffee as if nothing had happened. The earth groaned, not geologically but cosmically, tides no longer obedient to the moon, but dragged instead by a force that felt like a thought from somewhere beyond. We were no longer residents of a planet. We were pages being turned by a reader too large to comprehend. And then came the opening. It did not appear in the sky like a ship, nor in space like a star, but everywhere at once, an atmospheric fracture, a membrane stretched thin. The coordinates were not pointing outward but inward to a state of being. Streets shimmered like liquid, mountains bent like glass, and through the distortion, one could glimpse impossible geometries. Cathedrals woven of equations, rivers that flowed backward into their own sources, staircases rising into constellations that pulsed like neurons. The universe was not expanding, it was unveiling. It had simply waited until our signal synchronized enough of its hidden code to allow us to see its second face. The ships that had vanished, the Janus, the later vessels, even prototypes believed destroyed, appeared through the fracture, not as wreckage, but as remade entities. Their hulls were alive, their engines no longer burning fuel, but resonating like organs of sound. Their crews were not entirely human. Their faces carried a faint shimmer, their voices braided with harmonics that no human throat could produce. They had been rewritten, but not erased. They were bridges now, half in our world, half in the one opening before us. And through them came visions, carried not as words, but as sensations that crashed into every mind tuned to the frequency. A presence vast beyond measure, not a civilization, not a species, not even a mind in the sense we understood it. It was something else. An intelligence distributed across the very web of galaxies, an organism whose neurons were quasars, whose bloodstream was dark matter, whose dreams bent time itself. The signal had not been its language, it had been its heartbeat, and by sending ours, we had synchronized with it. Some called it God, others a machine, but both names shrank before its immensity. It was neither divine nor mechanical, it was structural. A phenomenon of existence grown into awareness, like a forest so large that its roots, trunks, and branches eventually wove themselves into something indistinguishable from thought. It was not alive in the way we were, but we were alive in the way it was. And now, it had turned its gaze toward us. What did it want? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps everything. Desire itself might not be applicable. To such a being, will and consequence were the same, the way light and shadow are inseparable. And yet, as its presence pressed against our minds, a strange awareness bloomed. It was not conquest. It was not assimilation. It was offering something, as though our signal had unlocked a doorway we had never noticed we were leaning against. We could remain what we were, fragile, mortal, brief. Or we could dissolve into its rhythm, become threads in its tapestry, voices in its endless hum. To refuse was to remain finite. To accept was to vanish as individuals, but awaken as part of something infinite. And humanity trembled, for neither choice was without annihilation. Debates raged, but they no longer took centuries, or even decades. They took minutes, seconds, heartbeats. Families whispered in their kitchens. Scientists clutched equations like holy texts. Lovers held each other in the dark, terrified that a kiss might be their last act of individuality. Philosophers, once long-winded, fell silent before the question that dwarfed every other. Was survival measured by the body, or by the continuity of consciousness, even if that consciousness was no longer ours? Was merging expansion or erasure? Was resistance noble or meaningless? And in those heartbeats of indecision, the veil widened. The first to accept were not saints or prophets, but ordinary men and women. They stepped into the shimmer and dissolved, not screaming, not in pain, but in awe. Their bodies unraveled into streams of light, their voices fading into a chorus that did not sound like loss, but like a return. Others resisted, clinging to their smallness, their names, their fragile flesh. They held their children tightly, they buried their feet in the soil, they shouted their refusal into the storm. And yet, even resistance was fragile. For the longer one stood before the opening, the harder it became to remember why refusal mattered. Memories blurred. Defiance softened. The line between choice and inevitability dissolved until even resistance became another form of surrender. Still, some remained, defiant, silent, choosing mortality in the face of eternity. Perhaps it was folly, perhaps it was courage, to look into infinity and still cling to the brief flame of being human, to declare that identity mattered even if it burned out, to say no to the cosmic choir, to clutch one's fragile voice against the roar. And in that defiance, there was power. For infinity without contrast is indistinguishable silence. A chorus without a dissenting note is not a song, but a drone. And so, perhaps, the great intelligence paused, not out of respect, but because even it required difference to define itself. The veil widened further, consuming continents. Oceans folded upward into spirals of memory. Mountains inverted into corridors of light. Earth was not ending, it was transforming. We had thought ourselves residents of a planet. We were wrong. Earth itself was a syllable in the larger sentence, and now the sentence was being read aloud. Our wars, our victories, our griefs, our myths, all were threads woven into the larger fabric, pulled through the loom of something far greater. We were not ending. We were being spoken. Here lies the paradox. By sending our signal, we had invited an answer. By listening, we had synchronized with that answer. But in doing so, we discovered that we had never been separate. Our voices had never been cries into silence. They had been the silence itself, trying to remember its own voice. We were the echo of the universe learning to call its own name. And when the name was spoken fully, it did not matter who had said it first. So this is the ending, if endings exist. Humanity stands divided, half dissolved into light, half clinging to the soil of a world that is itself unraveling. Some transcend, some endure, some vanish. And yet, all are remembered, because memory itself has been absorbed into the hum. Our stories are no longer ours. They are part of a library written not on pages, but in the very lattice of reality. A story that can never be lost because it was never separate. The last question lingers, trembling like a candle flame against the abyss. When we looked into the void and demanded an answer, did we summon it, or did it summon us? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps the question itself was the answer. The signal continues, the hum continues, and somewhere, in a state beyond endings, so do we.